Hello and welcome to another exciting lecture for Introduction to Psychology. The topic of this lecture is intelligence, one of the things I enjoy talking about. In these slides we will define intelligence. We're going to look at the history of intelligence, just looking at how it's been viewed throughout the history of psychology and how it's been looked at in different ways. We'll look at IQ tests, then we'll look at intelligence throughout the lifespan. We'll finish up with some extremes of intelligence in both directions, and I like to tack on creativity, even though your book doesn't put creativity in. I do like to tack on creativity because creativity is related to intelligence, but it's almost the opposite. Not necessarily in a bad way, but you'll see when we get to that. But you'll see how creativity is kind of a different form of thinking than intelligence is. All right, so first we have to define intelligence. And really there's a problem here, and that is that there is no single universally accepted definition of intelligence. All of the definitions that we have, they differ, and then people can point out examples where something doesn't work or point out something that the definition is missing. So that's really when it comes to intelligence. That is one thing you have to keep in mind is that our definition of what is intelligence is pretty variable. However, there are two central notions across all definitions. The first is the capacity to learn. So a big part of intelligence is your ability to learn. And the second is the capacity to adapt to the environment. That is, if you're given a challenge, the ability to overcome the challenge. Whenever we talk about intelligence, we have to look at it from the psychometric approach. So if you recall, the psychometric approach is the approach to psychology that looks at traits and the measurement of traits. So looks at how traits are measured, essentially how whatever it is we are interested in psychology, how we can come up with a way to quantify it. So intelligence is a trait, and it's a trait that characterizes some people to a greater extent than others. Some people have greater intelligence than others. We'll get to when we're talking about the history and looking at what intelligence is looked at as now, what I mean by that when I say some are looked at or characterized to a greater extent than others. But the point remains that intelligence is looked at as a trait that is quantifiable. Now let's start with the history of intelligence. We're going to go through it relatively briefly. I don't want these slides to be too long, so we'll go through some of this pretty quickly. First, the first real modern researcher that looked at intelligence was Galton. Galton looked at intelligence in the late 1800s, and interestingly enough, you know, my love for Darwin and evolution, Galton was one of Darwin's cousins. So it's just interesting tangent, interesting side of thing. So Galton really when he started to look at intelligence, he said that whatever intelligence is, it must be unitary, meaning there's one dimension to intelligence. We'll come back to that later because really that kind of shapes some of the theories of intelligence, this idea of unitary. So Galton said it must be unitary, it must be biological. So there must be something biological going on in the mind that is causing a higher intelligence. At the time, they thought it was due to like a big brain or big cortex or things like that. They weren't correct about that, but they did look at it as something biological. And he said that it must be something that can be measured directly. So the tests that they did for intelligence, they wanted to look at how to measure it, but Galton and others at the time viewed it as something that must be able to be measured directly. Interestingly enough, one of the things that Galton proposed as a measure of intelligence was reaction time. That might seem weird to you, but I'll actually come back to that and how he was actually on the right track there. But we'll come back to that later, because that, for a while there, that wasn't even thought to have anything to do with intelligence. But the points here are, again, one dimension, biological, and measured directly. So a while later, again, there's a bunch of researchers in here. I'm not going to go through the full history. If I was doing like a psychometrics class or a class on intelligence, I'd go into it more. But for a while here, a lot of people looked at it in a similar way. Along came Spearman, though. Spearman in the 1920s was a real big proponent of this one dimension that could be measured directly. And Spearman came up with this idea of intelligence being G, general intelligence, as well as you could have some other things that were individual differences relating to a test. The S is the specifics. But in general, Spearman looked at this one dimension, and it's called Spearman's G. And we talked about factor analysis when we looked at personality and the big five, and how all these different items were thrown together and factor analysis was run, and they were the five clusters were grouped together, which are the 5 personality traits. Well, when they looked at intelligence and intelligence testing and the different ways people were able to, at this point in time, identify what intelligence was, they ran that through factor analysis as well, and they came up with this G, this one factor that determined intelligence. Yes, there's, again, some things specific to the test. Maybe you're an expert in solving a certain type of problem, not because you're a high intelligence, but because you've spent years practicing those problems. So in that case, the specific things to the test might come in, but the general intelligence is this overarching one dimension of intelligence. So this is really the proponent of one dimension. Then came along Thurston, about 10 years later, and Thurston really changed the way intelligence was looked at. So Thurston said there's not one dimension of intelligence, there's actually 7 dimensions of intelligence. And these 7 dimensions are verbal comprehension, word fluency, number, space, associative memory, which is rote memory, perceptual speed, and reasoning. Kind of getting back to that reaction time speed thing, but really here we're looking at perceptual speed. So Thurston, really big, he had a big following. Spearman had a big following. There was a lot of competition between the two. The problem is Thurston's model did fall out of use because it couldn't predict intelligence and behavior better than G could. But it did start us on the path to multiple intelligences. We'll come back to that in just a few minutes when we look at other more modern multiple intelligence theories. And before I switch to that, I always like to talk about how, so these two, Thurston and Spearman, they were really at each other's throats. It was a heated debate about whether there was one dimension or these 7 dimensions, and it went on for years and years and years. But interestingly enough, towards the end, Spearman said that Thurston was right, and Thurston said that Spearman was right. So they kind of made up towards the end. Another way, or about 30 years after that, we started to look at intelligence. Still, again, prior to this time, it's still in favor of that one dimension, but looking at how there's actually 2 different types of intelligence within that Spearman's G. And really this looked at how the mind is now working. So this was crystallized versus fluid intelligence. Fluid intelligence is our ability to see relationships, analogies, letter and number series. This is our primary reasoning ability that in most people peaks in the 20s. This is a lot related to basically we become experts in these types of things due to our schooling. However, crystallized intelligence is our acquired knowledge of skills, our factual knowledge. There's a big cultural influence that comes into this. It's experience-based, And this can even increase into your 70s because it's our acquired knowledge, and you can keep acquiring knowledge and skills. So this isn't looking at it like Spearman looked at it, or even Thurston looked at it. This is looking at it more like we've got two different mechanisms that are going on in our brain. One is our acquired knowledge and skills, and the other is our ability to make connections. So this is where this type of intelligence gets separated from the others. Now, I could talk here more about other intelligences that took place between this and the next one. Again, if I was doing a full class on it, it's really interesting, some of the theories out there. One theory of intelligence actually had over 140 different dimensions of intelligence, just really beyond the scope of even being able to be measured. And others just went back and forth. But then we get to the next one, which got us to more of a modern view of intelligence. So Gardner was a supporter of Thurston, and he also believed that intelligence was multidimensional, that there isn't just this one dimension. And he also had 7 intelligences. They're not the same as Thurston's intelligences, though. And when we look at this list that I'm about to put up, and you can already see over here on the right, you see that it's kind of goes beyond the scope of what Spearman looked at as intelligence, which is why researchers now, even though Spearman's G and one dimension is the basic cornerstone of intelligence, people also look at Gardner and say, yes, if you extend the definition of intelligence, these other things are intelligences as well, and they are not able to be measured better by one dimension. So these are, again, verbal and mathematical. These are things that Thurston talked about. But now we've got things like musical ability. So somebody who's not necessarily good at verbal ability may be good at musical ability. So this is how you get multiple different dimensions here working. Spatial ability, spatial intelligence, so your ability to understand the world in 3 dimensions around you. Kinesthetic, which is your ability to coordinate your body's movement. So here's where you get athletes and dancers and things like that that may have high kinesthetic intelligence, even if they don't necessarily have high mathematical ability. And then you get things like interpersonal and intrapersonal, your ability to understand yourself as well as your social skills. So if we extend the definition of intelligence beyond just our ability to solve problems, then you start to see that these other dimensions here that are on this slide, these other dimensions are not going to be able to be measured with just one test. So this is a lot of modern theorists look at this as when you extend the definition of intelligence, this is what you should be looking at is these 7 things. However, that being said, this is much harder to test. So we look at this as the psychometric approach. And if you remember, the psychometric approach that I just talked about a few minutes ago is all about quantifying and being able to measure. Well, this test here is now 7 tests instead of 1 test. And it's already difficult enough to administer IQ tests, which we're going to start talking about on the next slide. But to now administer IQ tests that are measuring 7 different things rather than 1 thing really takes it beyond what most people are willing to do for testing. So here you have to understand that the difference between Spearman's G and Gardner and Thurston's multiple intelligences isn't really which one is best, it is now which one is easiest to administer and test, which is why almost all of the IQ tests that you can take today are based off from Spearman's G, not Gardner's multiple intelligences. That being said, the researchers and the IQ theorists all agree that Gardner's 7 intelligences do have merit, do have validity. It's just they're not easy to test. Let's get into that testing. So IQ testing is next, and that is a very, in my opinion, interesting history of IQ tests. And when I say interesting, I definitely don't mean in a positive way. There are some positive things, there are some definitely negative things, but the history of IQ testing has a very interesting past. So, first we'll talk about the earliest versions of IQ tests. The earliest versions of IQ tests were created by Alfred Binet, and you might recognize that name, and Theodore Simon. And these tests were basically done it was developed in France. It was the French government actually went to these IQ researchers and said, could you develop an IQ test? So it was developed in France, and it was developed to identify children that may need additional education. As I said before, it was based on Spearman's G, and essentially what it did is it allowed the tester, the person administering the test, to compare a person's actual age with their mental age. So they did this by looking at how their peers did. So how did people at a certain age typically do on this test? And then compared how that individual did, and if they did worse, they were considered to be lower than average IQ. If they did better, they were considered to be above average IQ. And it came down to, there's a formula for it. They did mental age divided by basically the age appropriate, the what they should be at, and then multiplied it by 100. The mean ends up being 100 then. If you're rated average, you've got a IQ of 100. And this test, again, had very good origins. Like I said, developed in France to identify children that needed additional education. So it was designed even early on to help out those who may need additional assistance, additional teaching. Then the Binet-Simon test became the Stanford-Binet intelligence scale. This is why I said you should be able to recognize the name Binet, because the Stanford-Binet intelligence test or Stanford-Binet intelligence scale is the gold standard of IQ tests that we have now. And this is where now the US got a hold of it. And of course the US did what the US does and started using it for ways that it probably shouldn't have been used for. So it was initially used in the US to determine if immigrants would be allowed into the country. It was also used to test what jobs people in the military should have. And I put this question on here, what problems could you see this having? Just thinking about it for a minute. And really what this comes down to is, first off, I have to tell how the test was done. The test was a written test. So if you couldn't read, you were going to fail the test. You were basically going to have essentially no score. If you couldn't read English, because it was in English, you were going to have no score. So if you're determining which immigrants are allowed into the country or what jobs people would be appropriate for in the military during World War II, things like that, then the problem is those who couldn't read or those who didn't speak English ended up essentially getting left out of the process. So the modern tests, it's really changed since then. The tests now are administered in multiple languages. They're culturally normed. That was another problem with the original tests, is people from specific cultural backgrounds would understand the questions better and therefore be able to do better. Even if somebody could read and speak English, if they came from, let's say, the country, a different cultural background than the upper middle class white males who wrote the tests, then they would have trouble with the tests, not because they're low IQ, not because they're low intelligence, but because the questions were culturally based. And you get this then with different cultural backgrounds from different races, things like this. So the early tests had a lot of problems. The one benefit that we look at now of having all these problems in the past is because we identified the problems, we now have tests that are much better at getting around these cultural biases, language biases, and even racial biases. Basically, there's other tests out there. There's the Wechsler, there's the Wonderlic, there's a bunch of different tests that you can take that essentially are doing the same thing. They are looking at comparing people to their peers. And when kids are younger, when we get before adulthood, you can compare people to other individuals that are the same age. So the norms are age normed. In adulthood, we just basically look at everybody versus an adult norm. It comes in a symmetrical bell curve, which you see down here at the bottom. The average is 100 in the middle here. About 2/3 of the people who take the test score between 85 and 115. It's actually about 68% of people should be between 85 and 115. So when you look at that, about 68% of people, the majority of people, are going to be in this range of 85 to 115. So the average intelligence is within there. It's only the very rare exceptions that have scores above 130, only about 2.2% of people, or scores below 70, again, only about 2.2% of people. It's not directly corresponding to that anymore. We'll talk about this in a minute, how IQ scores on average have gone up. But at the same time, when we look at the IQ tests and the results, about 95% of people, and 95.5% of people, fall between 70 and 130. So when we talk about the extremes of intelligence, have to understand that that is relatively rare. As you know, I like to talk about nature versus nurture when we're talking about various different things in this class. One of the things to look at is intelligence, and intelligence is actually one of the interesting ones in that it's about 50-50. About 50% of intelligence is accounted for based on nature, and 50% is accounted for based on nurture. However, extremely poor environments can affect this. Extremely poor environments, like environments where people aren't getting mental stimulation, where there's lack of nutrition, where there's abuse, environments like that, then the genetics basically, it accounts for very little in that context, because the environment, the extremes of the environment, are really pulling it away from the genetics. But that's the case in a lot of different things when you look at nature versus nurture. When you even look at things like your height, the height you're going to get to. You've got a height maximum that you can get to based on your genes. Your nutrition is going to affect that. But if you're in a really harsh environment where you're getting no nutrition or very little nutrition, then you're not even going to get anywhere near your theoretical maximum for height. And intelligence is very similar. There is a couple factors out there that do influence IQ scores. We're going to look at 3 of them here. First is birth order. This is one of the interesting ones. What we know from studies is firstborn children tend to score higher on IQ tests. Doesn't guarantee they score higher, just like any time we talk about differences, when we talk about any differences in things, we're talking about the average, the mean is different, not necessarily the curve. Let me even draw that out here. So you've got 2 bell-shaped curves for intelligence. For firstborn children, they're here, and then secondborn children are here. Even looking here, you've got, when we look at this line here, you've got about, I don't know, 30% of second-born children that are smarter than first-born children. So it's not necessary, and this is even a wide mean difference. It could be even smaller than this. If the difference is only like 1 or 2 IQ points, then it's going to be much smaller than this. The point is, whenever we talk about differences, and I have to bring this up here because we're going to talk about some that are more sensitive in a couple slides, but when we talk about differences, we have to look at the fact that the means are different, not everyone is different. So what is going on with firstborn children? Some of it is teaching, some of it's education, but we've actually got, or there is what's called IQ fat cells in mothers that have been found. And these are fat cells that build up around the hips. They're specific type of fat cell. And these types of fat cells get built up during puberty. And then once the mother has a child, these fat cells start depleting. They deplete, the majority of them deplete for the first child, some will deplete for subsequent children, and these fat cells do not basically fill themselves back up later in life. So once they've been depleted, they've been depleted. And these fat cells are believed during the pregnancy to be something that contributes towards the fetal development and towards fetal brain development that aids in IQ. So it's just, again, one of those interesting things out there that's been found. Poverty, again, is a factor that influences IQ. I talked about it a couple slides ago on nature versus nurture, but what it comes down to is inadequate health and dental care, inadequate nutrition, overcrowded, unsafe neighborhoods, chronic stress. If your relationship with your parents isn't affectionate and supportive, which tends to happen in poverty, if there's lack of opportunity for cognitive stimulation, all of these things can contribute to lower intelligence. And children who live in poverty on average score 10 to 20 points below middle class age peers on IQ tests. That is a pretty big difference. That is a pretty significant difference. And this is irrespective of race or anything like that. We're just looking at social economic status, income, history, and again, it comes down to here is those who grew up in these situations of chronic stress and low nutrition, low health care, all of these tend to do much worse on IQ tests. Now, part of this could be they're just not prepared for testing like that. Maybe they don't go to school, maybe they don't pay attention in school, things like that, so they aren't prepared for the tests, but there's still a definite mental factor going on here that's a difference. Next one we're going to look at is the sensitive one. It's always a sensitive topic to bring it up, but how do race and ethnicity affect intelligence? In the US, we know that Asian American and European American children tend to score slightly higher on IQ tests than African American, Native American, and Hispanic American. That being said, again, it is a very small difference. But now we have to ask the question, is this due to genetics or some other factor? And what's actually been found is even when you control for poverty, control for social economic status, control for all of these different things, there is definitely some genetic factor still going into it. Again, these differences are so minor that you wouldn't even be able to notice it typically, except in some situations. What you see here on the right, Einstein. So Ashkenazi Jews, they have higher than average IQs. Their IQ is about 10 to 15 points higher on average than non-Ashkenazi Jews. So what is going on here? Well, we look at this historically. This is a sect of Jews that was in northern central Europe for years and years and years in Europe. It was against, so at this time it was Christian, and it was against Christian religion to be a moneylender. It was considered to be a sin to lend money and charge interest. Not to lend money, to charge interest. So you didn't get money lenders that were Christian because they couldn't charge interest, they couldn't make money. It wasn't against Jewish religion. So the Ashkenazi Jews were money lenders. They made a lot of money, but because they were money lenders, accountants, bankers, things like that, there was this benefit to being intelligent. So the parents who were selecting for who would marry who, because Ashkenazi Jews were only allowed to marry other Ashkenazi Jews, and the selection process went that those who were intelligent, those whose parents were intelligent and the kids were showing high levels of intelligence, high levels of number ability, stuff like that, growing up, those were selected to marry so that they could have kids that were smarter. And through this, through generation after generation after generation of this selection going on, it resulted in a higher than average IQ for this religious group, or they're basically an ethnicity now. So we do know there are some genetic factors that do go into intelligence. And again, when we look at these differences in most groups, that the Ashkenazi Jews are the exception, they're not the rule. The differences that we find in most racial and ethnic groups are so minor that the only way you'd be able to tell is through testing. And again, you have to test so many people to get a mean that's just slightly different. So it's one of those, I'm not pushing for one is higher than the other. I'm just saying that the means are slightly different, but it's a very small effect for the most part. So let's look at some problems with IQ tests. I kind of talked about this when I talked about the test earlier. There is a cultural bias in testing, or at least there used to be. So IQ tests used in the US in the past were designed for children from white middle class backgrounds. So this has been corrected. Hopefully it's been fully corrected now. They've really worked on getting these tests to have no cultural bias in testing. However, something called stereotype threat is still present. So stereotype threat is this essentially cognitive bias that we have internally, not externally, internally, a fear that you're going to be judged to have qualities associated with a negative stereotype. Actually, it's even with positive stereotypes too. It's that you're going to be, this belief that you're going to be judged to have qualities associated with a stereotype actually affects performance. So what I mean by this, or an example, math. Math is a good example. So math, there's this stereotype that boys, are better at math than girls. So there's this stereotype, this belief that boys are better at math than girls. The truth of the matter is, when all things are kept equal, there is no difference, gender difference in mathematical ability. However, there is this belief that boys are better than girls. If you put boys and girls into a math test and they take the test, they'll score a certain way. But if you say before the test starts to the girls that girls are worse at math than boys, the girls will actually do poorer on the test. This is where stereotype threat comes in. This fear that you're going to be judged to have qualities associated with the stereotype actually affects performance. And it affects it in both ways too. We found this with the stereotype that Asian children are better at math. If you tell Asian children that are taking a math test, Asian American children that are taking a math test before they take the test, if you tell them that Asian children do better on math, they'll actually do worse because they have this fear that they're not going to live up to the standard, that type of thing. So the stereotype threat is something that's real. It's typically something that has to be brought to your attention, but it's still present even when it's not directly brought to your attention. Let's kind of go throughout the lifespan. We talked about developmental last week, but I just kind of want to look at how IQ works in the lifespan because it's really something closely tied into developmental. So the first thing is the Bailey scales of infant development. So the Bailey scales of infant development are used for infants from 1 to 42 months of age. There's a motor scale, a mental scale, and a behavioral rating scale. And these infants are then rated compared to their age peer norms. So they're compared to how others the same age do on these different things, how their behaviors are, how their motor skills are, how their mental is as well. So you do have that mental component. But for the most part, the Bayley scales of infant development are not IQ based. They are more of development based, which again, it's good for charting developmental progress. You can diagnose neurological conditions and mental deficiencies that are going on during this time. But really, what the thing that needs to be pointed out is there is very low to no correlation between developmental quotient and IQ. So there is no relationship between developmental quotient and intelligence quotient. It's basically good to identify early problems, but those who are behind developmentally are not necessarily going to have lower IQ. Actually, what's been found that is the best predictors of later IQ, things you can measure in infants, so infants' attention, speed of habituation, preference for novelty, and back to this, fast reaction time. Fast reaction time in infants, so if you test infant reaction time, those with the fastest reaction times tend to have the highest IQs later. So we go back to Galton from earlier and how he said that it needed to be measured with something like reaction time. Turns out that's actually pretty accurate, that reaction time is highly related to intelligence, and reaction time in infants is one of the best ways to test early intelligence in infants. Into childhood years, just going to go through this relatively quick. So scores fluctuate the most with those who live in unstable environments. We already talked about that. Those who are living in poverty get noticeable drops in IQ. Those who have IQ scores that increase through childhood tend to have parents who foster achievement, a parent who's neither too strict nor too lax. So when we talked about the parenting styles, that warm, authoritative, affectionate parenting style. In adolescence, the formal operations are occurring, and this allows for IQ scores to become more stable. And this is one thing, even though IQ scores early in life can predict later, really it's not that accurate for predicting a 7-year-old's IQ to their IQ in adulthood. However, in adolescence, because IQ becomes much more stable, it is able to predict adulthood IQ. However, the biggest thing, and we're going to talk in a minute about what does IQ do for the individual, what's the benefits of high IQ, what are the not necessarily benefits. One thing, the biggest benefit in childhood and adolescence of a high IQ is actually school achievement. Not looking at things like other domains, social, all of that. Just high IQ is just a good predictor of school achievement. And actually another domain that it's not here, another domain that high IQ predicts is actually athletics. Might seem counterintuitive because the stereotypical football player is dumb, that stereotype, but really what it comes down to is those who have high IQ, because of that, going back to reaction time, mental processing speed, in fast-paced sports they tend to do better because their mind works faster. And this has actually been panned out in when you look at the NFL. So the NFL, one of the things they do before the draft is they have the NFL Combine. So in the NFL Combine, they're having prospects do a bunch of different things. They have them run a 40-yard dash. They have them do some weightlifting, a bunch of different things like that. One of the things they have these prospects do is take an IQ test. And why do they do that? Because these scouts are smart enough to know, or have enough knowledge to know, that IQ is predictive of performance. And what you find is, especially at positions like quarterback, running back, receiver, corners, those types of positions, those people who have higher IQ on average tend to do better at them. Yes, you still need the physical ability, you still need all that other stuff, but higher IQ, higher mental processing speed actually aids them in being better. It's almost all of the quarterbacks in the NFL have exceptionally high IQ. Then looking at adulthood, we get into that IQ can, at least to a certain extent, uh, basically predict certain things, such as income, occupational prestige, complexity of work, job performance ratings, even health. Those with higher IQ tend to be healthier and live longer than those with lower scores. There is issues here that this isn't the best predictor, but it does predict these things. I'll come back to in a minute something else that's just as important, but it does predict or is associated with a lot of these beneficial things. As far as how IQ goes throughout the lifespan, IQ tends to rise slightly until the mid-40s and then decline, but this is actually cross-sectional data. In longitudinal data, it tends to stay more stable, at least up until people reach their 80s. What are some factors that cause declines in IQ? Things like poor health, so diseases, drugs that are used to treat diseases, so side effects of those. There is what's called a terminal drop, a rapid decline in intellectual abilities within a few years of death. And this goes back to what I talked about before in the developmental slides, is really this use it or lose it. So those who live an unstimulating lifestyle, so those who have low social status, those who have few activities, those who are dissatisfied with their lives, those who don't have social groups, those who don't do problem-solving tasks, those are the biggest predictors of declines in intelligence later in life. And one of the things that associated with that is that decline in intelligence towards the end of life is actually related to an earlier or living a shorter amount of time. Those who do maintain their intelligence tend to have advanced education, intact marriages, and again there you've got then that person to socialize with. They lead physically and mentally active lifestyles. So physical exercise can increase or may help you maintain your intelligence, but you also need to have that mental component in it, because again, it's a big use it or lose it. One thing that's been occurring, and I said this earlier when I was talking about intelligence and how intelligence is actually going up on average. So we tend to when we make intelligence tests, we tend to think of that 100 as the average. And we compare people to those who are of the same age or of the same age category in adulthood when we make these intelligence quotient comparisons. However, one thing we know is that about every decade, so over every decade, over every 10 years, intelligence on average is increasing by 3 to 4 points. So if you were to take an IQ test now, if I gave 1,000 people an IQ test now versus those 1,000 people who took an IQ test 100 years ago, the people now would be on average 30 points higher than those from before if they were normed against each other. If you norm the people now against the people from 100 years ago. Now, again, when we say that the average is 100, what ends up happening there is in most IQ scales, even though people are getting smarter, the average number is still 100. So really, when we're looking at this, when we talk about IQ scores increasing, we're talking about IQ scores increasing if normed against those from the past. And what's going on here? Better education, better nutrition, better health, But even then, do we have better education and better nutrition now than 20 years ago? But it's still gone up 5 points in the last 20 years? That's not necessarily. So what is going on here? It comes down to the fact of the human mind is very adaptable, and I don't mean like evolution adaptable. I mean the human mind is able to learn even better than we're learning now, and we have the potential to have an higher intelligence than we even have now. It is more of the type of information that's being processed. And as we process more and more complex information, as education gets more and more complex, our minds are able to develop better and to be more intelligent. So let's look at the extremes of disability. We've got the two extremes, the top end and the bottom end. We'll start with the bottom end, that is intellectual disability. It is defined as significantly below average intellectual functioning with limitations in adaptive behavior such as self-care, social skills that originates before the age of 18. It used to be defined as a strict IQ number, so intellectual disability was indicated by an IQ score below 75 historically, but now we look at it as more than just the number. We look at, so that the new definition in the DSM-5 looks at intellectual disability not just as what your actual IQ is, but your ability to function. So your ability to meet age-appropriate expectations, your ability to take care of yourself, things like that. So while the numbers of IQ is still important and it's still used as a guideline, it is no longer what it defines someone as being intellectually disabled. What now defines that is their ability to function, their ability to take care of themselves. And if you take a abnormal class, you get into the different levels of intellectual disability. I'm not going to get into those here. I'm just going to talk about the fact that there are different levels, and it's more on your functioning rather than a specific number. What are the causes of intellectual disability? Well, there's actually thousands of known causes. There's organic conditions, biological causes, heredity factors, diseases, injuries, maternal alcohol use, anoxia, basically lack of oxygen during birth. But then there are, just as common, is no identifiable organic cause. So it's just a combination of genetics and environment that we can't fully identify what is going on. On the other end of the spectrum is giftedness. So giftedness is defined as basically showing high IQ or, and again, the number isn't the only thing that's important, high IQ or having special abilities in areas valued by society, such as mathematics, leadership, performing, or visual arts. And this kind of goes back to what I was talking about how our modern tests are all based on Spearman's G, but when you look at Gardner's view of intelligence and how there's these other things like kinesthetic, so the visual arts, the performing arts, stuff like that are going to come into musical ability, is going to cause that to come into effect. So what you get here is we don't just look at giftedness now as a number, just like we don't look at intellectual disability as a number. We look at giftedness as either having that high IQ number or having ability, a special ability in an area that's valued by society. Just to finish up on IQ testing, it comes down to, Binet had two major warnings about IQ tests that many people ignore to today. The first is intelligence tests don't measure innate abilities or natural intelligence. They measure your ability to perform the tasks on the test. And intelligence tests by themselves shouldn't be used to label people. And again, that's why I say that now in the modern way psychology looks at things like intellectual disability, we look at it much more to not their number on a test, but their functioning that they have. And as the last major warning against intelligence and valuing intelligence too high is that intelligence doesn't mean an individual do well in the school or their career. It does predict these things, but just because a person has high intelligence doesn't mean they're going to get good grades in school, doesn't mean they're going to do well in their job, all of those types of things. That is because just as important as intelligence is motivation to succeed. And this quote, I really love this quote. That is, it's not that I'm lazy, it's just that I don't care. It's not that motivation isn't along those lines. It's not that I'm not smart enough. It's just that I don't care to do the work to appear to be smart enough. I use myself as an example here. So I have a 165 IQ. When I was last measured, it was at 165. That is an extremely high IQ. That is about 1 in 10,000 when you look at the numbers. And I'm not saying that to brag, I'm just saying that to use as part of the example here. When I first went to college, so I went in the Army after high school. When I first got out of the Army, I went to college, and after 2 semesters at college, I had a 0.05 GPA, or it was a 0.5 GPA, sorry, 0.5 GPA, and I got kicked out of that school. It's not because I wasn't smart enough to do the work. I could easily do the work. It's because I personally, at that point in time in my life, was not motivated to do the work. I was more motivated to stay in my dorm room and play video games than I was to go to class. And so I understand when students are at a point in their lives where they're just having difficulty motivating themselves to do the work, because I have been there. So, and then I changed majors a few times, and I went back for psychology, and when I finally went back for psychology, I ended up with a 4.0 GPA over 3 years of getting my psychology undergrad degree, and now I have a PhD. It's not lack of ability there, it was lack of motivation. So, just having a high IQ doesn't mean you're going to succeed. You actually have to have the motivation to succeed to go along with it. And people with low intellectual ability, below average, not way below average, but below average, who have very high motivation. The people that work hard, the people that study 12, 14 hours a day, that are constantly working on bettering themselves, those people actually tend to have better outcomes in the long run than those who are above average intelligence that are a little bit lazy. Okay, now that that's said, I said I'd talk about creativity. I've got just a few slides of creativity. So creativity is kind of, I'm not even going to say it's the antithesis of intelligence. So creativity is on a different dimension. Whereas intelligence measures convergent thinking. IQ scores, intelligence is basically measuring convergent thinking. Convergent is where you're coming up with the best single answer. You've got all this information and you use your mind to process the best single answer to a question or a problem. However, creativity is about coming up with novel responses. So creativity is about divergent thinking, the ability to generate a variety of ideas or solutions. There might be one answer that's the best answer. It says here when there's no single correct answer. There might still be one answer that's the best answer, but creativity is the ability to come up with novel or divergent ideas, many different ideas, and maybe even if one is the best answer for one situation, by being able to be more creative, you can more easily come up with a more adaptable solution that is better in multiple scenarios. So creativity, again, is novel responses that are appropriate in context and valued by others. That's how we define creativity. It's got to be novel and appropriate and valued by others. So again, IQ, convergent thinking, coming up with the single best answer. Creativity, divergent thinking, generating a variety of different ideas or solutions. These aren't mutually exclusive. Some people are both high intelligence and highly creative. Some people are low in both. But they are closely related to each other, but also separate. And that's why I do bring up creativity whenever I talk about intelligence. So looking at it, since we looked at intelligence in children and in adolescents, let's look at creativity in children and adolescents. So preschoolers have a very high amount of divergent thought. However, once they start going to school, their divergent thought becomes less. Because it becomes in school, it's more about, again, the teachers are teaching coming up with the best solution. So it's about convergent thinking rather than divergent thinking. There's this, what's called the fourth grade slump. This is when creativity is at its lowest. But then in around puberty, the levels of divergent thought again rise again. So children, preschool, very divergent in thinking, very creative. Throughout the elementary years tend to be very much less creative, but then into adolescence start to be creative again. So adolescents regain that creativeness. They produce highly creative work. Creative thought is part of the intellectual development that's occurring. Things like curiosity, imagination, willingness to take calculated risks are all part of this divergent thinking that comes with creativity. I'm not going to talk about creativity more than that, just wanted to point out that there are some similarities between the two, but there's definitely differences. And again, creativity is something that should be valued just as highly as intelligence is in its own way. So in this set of slides, we looked at intelligence, looked at a brief history of intelligence, did some stuff with IQ tests, as well as issues with IQ tests, looked at intelligence throughout the lifespan, did some extremes of intelligence, both high and low, looked at motivation and how that's at maybe just as important, and finished with creativity and how that is, again, not mutually exclusive with intelligence, but in its own way just important. Thank you. Come on back.